"Are you sure you are awake right now?" Notice how the answer rises almost instantly, of course. And then, just behind that confidence, a faint unease. What if this certainty could be mistaken? Dreams disturb the smooth surface of our assurance. In them, we walk through rooms that never were, speak with the dead, feel shame or joy for things that never happened. And yet, while we dream, it can all feel utterly real. From this tension, a long philosophical worry unfolds. If a dream can imitate waking life so convincingly, how can we ever be completely sure that we are not dreaming now? This is the heart of Descartes' dream argument. If a moment by the fire or the sound of rain can be perfectly reproduced in sleep, then the senses alone can never prove that what appears before us truly exists. Experience by itself may not be enough to secure the real. But the dream is not only a weapon of doubt, it is also a phenomenon in its own right. What is it that we are actually talking about when we say, "I had a dream"? One path says a dream is a genuine experience during sleep, a kind of inner hallucination, a world spun from within. Another path is more unsettling. Perhaps the dream is assembled as we wake, a swift story woven from scattered traces in the brain, like a cassette pressed into the mind at the moment of rising. On this view, what we remember is not a faithful record of a night world, but a waking construction that only pretends to be one. Any careful journey into dreams now passes through the brain. Modern science watches the sleeping mind waves of activity, shifting chemicals, sudden bursts of inner light. Some theories suggest that the brain is always guessing, always building models of the world, and that dreams are what happens when these models run free, uncorrected by the senses. If so, dreams might be more than idle fantasies. They could be rehearsals of danger, experiments with emotion, or windows into consciousness itself, showing us a mind that, even in darkness, cannot stop generating worlds. As we begin this exploration, you are invited to linger with a simple, unsettling question. What is happening when you dream, and what exactly is happening now, as you listen and call this moment awake? Part 1. The Cartesian Dream Argument. Consider now the most ordinary scene you can imagine. You are sitting by a fire. You feel the warmth on your hands. You see the light flicker on the pages of a book. The chair holds your weight. The room is quiet, solid, and familiar. It seems like the very picture of certainty. This is precisely the kind of moment Descartes asks us to doubt. In his meditations, he does not begin with wild hallucinations or obvious fantasies. He begins with the gentle confidence of daily life, the fire, the paper, the clothes on his body. Then he introduces a simple question. Have I not sometimes dreamed that I was in exactly such a situation, sitting by the fire, reading a book, entirely convinced that I was awake? If a dream can feel like this, he wonders, what marks this moment out as real and that moment as mere appearance? Descartes is not impressed by the familiar tricks of the senses. A stick looks bent in water. A tower seems round from far away and angular up close. These, he thinks, are easy cases. We know how to correct them. We change our position, we move closer, we use other senses, and the deception dissolves. Dreams are more unsettling. In a vivid dream, there is no second vantage point, no chance to step back and re-check. Within the dream, all the senses agree. The chair feels solid. The fire warms your skin. You hear the crackle of wood and the soft rustle of pages. Vision, touch, sound, even smell and bodily posture line up to tell the same story. And then you wake up. Descartes invites us to dwell on this disjunction. A few seconds earlier, you were utterly convinced. Now you see that nothing in that world existed. The bed you are actually lying in bears no relation to the train you were missing, the cliff you were falling from, or the person you were arguing with. The feelings were real. The objects were not. From this, he draws a disturbing possibility. Perhaps at this very moment, as you listen to these words, you are in just such a state. Perhaps you will wake up in 10 seconds or 10 years and look back on this entire stretch of life as a particularly intricate dream. Out of this possibility, philosophers have reconstructed two versions of the dream argument. One is the radical, always dreaming version. On this interpretation, Descartes entertains the thought that he may have been dreaming continuously. All of his experiences, from childhood to now, might have belonged to one vast, unbroken dream. If that were so, none of his perceptions would ever have touched an external world. We rarely take this literally in our own lives, but it has a certain eerie resonance. There is something haunting about the idea of a life lived entirely in an inward theatre, a consciousness floating within itself, never anchored to any independent reality at all. The second, more modest version is often closer to our own unease. Call it the now dreaming doubt. On this reading, Descartes does not need to assume that he is always dreaming. He only needs to admit that he has sometimes been mistaken about being awake, and then ask, how can I ever be entirely sure that I am not mistaken right now? The problem is not that all my sensory beliefs are false. The problem is that I cannot, from the inside, sort the true ones from the dream-born ones. If dreaming and waking can be subjectively indistinguishable, then the mere feeling of certainty can no longer be trusted as a guide to reality. We can express the structure of the doubt in simple terms. If I really knew that there was a fire in front of me, I would have to know that I am not dreaming. But I do not, and perhaps cannot know that I am not dreaming. So I cannot be completely sure that there is, in fact, a fire. The conclusion spreads the same reasoning applies to the table, the book, the room, my body, even the passage of time, from one moment to the next. Notice, though, what Descartes does not doubt at this stage. He does not question mathematics. 2 plus 3 still make 5, whether he is awake or asleep. A square still has 4 sides. The truths of arithmetic and geometry seem to hold regardless of the state he is in. Dreams can fabricate objects, events and bodies, but they do not seem able to make contradictions true. So dream skepticism, in its Cartesian form, is oddly limited and precise. It is not a universal madness. It leaves intact a small island of certainty, abstract reasoning, simple logic, clear and distinct ideas. The storm of doubt rages around sensory beliefs, what we see, hear, feel and touch, but not around the structure of pure thought itself. This is why Descartes can still pursue pure, rational inquiry even under the shadow of the dream. He wants to strip away everything that depends on the senses and see what, if anything, remains. If he can find at least one belief that survives even the harshest skeptical scenarios, he can rebuild knowledge from that foundation. But on the way to that foundation, the dream argument forces an uncomfortable realization. Our ordinary trust in perception is rooted less in strict proof and more in habit. We believe that we are awake because reality feels continuous, because others seem to agree with us, because we can trace the line of our day from morning to evening. The dream argument asks us to imagine all of this as part of a larger dream. Imagine that your memories of this morning are themselves dream memories. Imagine that the friends who assure you that you are awake are themselves dream characters. The continuity of experience becomes part of the illusion rather than a guarantee against it. To sit with this possibility is to feel a certain vertigo. It is not just that specific beliefs might be false. It is that the entire framework within which beliefs make sense here, now the world, might be floating free of any external anchor. Some people hear this and shrug. We wake up every day, they say clearly, we are not trapped in a permanent dream. But this reply misses the point. Descartes is not primarily making a claim about what is actually happening. He is asking what we can rule out from the inside. And his answer is less than we thought. The dream argument does something more subtle than simply telling us that we might be mistaken. It exposes a gap between appearance and reality, a gap that the senses alone cannot close. It reminds us that subjectively convincing experience is not, by itself, a final court of appeal. That is why this centuries-old thought still unsettles. It is not about a particular historical philosopher or a quaint puzzle from the past. It is about the fragility of our everyday confidence, the ease with which of course I'm awake can be followed a second later by but what really proves that. For Descartes, the dream argument is a stage in a larger journey. He will go further, imagining even more radical deceivers. But the dream is the first decisive break. It shows that the mind can generate, or at least undergo, a world so persuasive that reality and illusion become, for a time, indistinguishable. To ask whether you are dreaming right now is not mainly to suspect that you are. It is to discover how much of your sense of reality rests on trust, habit, and the quiet assumption that things are as they seem. It is to glimpse, however briefly, how strange it is to be a conscious creature at all, forever dependent on experiences that might, in principle, have been fashioned in sleep. Part 2. The history of dream skepticism. Across centuries, philosophers have turned to dreams as little laboratories of doubt. Long before Descartes, people noticed that in sleep we seem to inhabit a world that later evaporates. They sensed that this must mean something troubling for our claims to know. In ancient Greece, this worry appears already beneath the surface of Plato's dialogues. In the Theaetetus, when Socrates and his young companion are searching for a definition of knowledge, they keep running into a problem. Perception is unstable. What we see and feel changes with distance, with health, with mood. Dreams and waking illusions are woven into this discussion as examples of how easily appearances can mislead. For Plato, these reflections push him toward the thought that knowledge cannot, simply be identified with what is given to the senses. Dreams are not a central focus, but they are part of a larger pattern. The world of perception is in flux, whereas the objects of genuine knowledge must be stable and reliable. Later, in the skeptical traditions that grow from Hellenistic philosophy, dreams take on a more explicit role. The Pyrrhonists, for example, collect standard modes or patterns of argument for suspending judgment. Dreams appear alongside madness, illness, joy, grief, and cultural variation. The lesson is broad. Our impressions change with our condition. We have no neutral vantage point from which to declare that one state, rather than another, shows things as they really are. For these thinkers, the point is not to build a new system on top of doubt, but to cultivate a certain kind of tranquility. If the senses are unreliable and no secure foundation can be found, perhaps the wisest response is to lower the stakes of belief itself, to live without the anxiety of chasing certainty that will never come. In late antiquity and the early Christian period, the tone shifts. Augustine, for instance, takes the skeptical challenge seriously, including the challenge from dreams. In his writings, he notes the disturbing similarity between dream experience and waking experience. How can we be sure, he asks, that we are not continually deceived? Yet Augustine also emphasizes something hopeful. Looking back, he says, we can usually distinguish dreams and illusions from waking perception. In retrospect, the dream world has a certain fragility. It lacks the coherence, the sharedness, the stability of ordinary life. For him, this retrospective insight loosens the grip of dream skepticism. While dreams may confuse us in the moment, they do not, he thinks, overthrow our general trust in God's creation or in the reliability of our faculties when rightly ordered. Centuries later, Michel de Montaigne, the great essayist of the French Renaissance, revisits these questions. With a more personal, wandering style, he writes of our days as filled with reveries, half-waking fancies and self-deceptions that blur into the night's more obvious dreams. In some ways, he suggests our waking life is even more worrying than sleep, because we mistake its illusions for clear-eyed judgment. For Montaigne, dreams are part of a broader meditation on human frailty. We are creatures prone to error, swayed by passion, suggestion, and custom. The boundaries between waking and dreaming, sanity and madness, appear less sharp than our pride would like to believe. Through all of these earlier treatments, a pattern emerges. Dreams are a useful example, but they are rarely granted center stage. They stand in line with other sources of error distance, sickness, intoxication, strong emotion. They support a general lesson about human fallibility. Descartes changes the mood and the focus. In the Meditations, dreams do not appear as a passing illustration. They become a carefully developed, almost theatrical device. He spends time with them. He gives them room to breathe. He does this in a strikingly intimate voice. The Meditations are written not as a detached treatise, but as a first-person drama of doubt. A single narrator sits alone, withdrawing from the world, and begins to question everything he believes. This style is part of what gives Descartes' dream argument its lasting force. The meditator is not a distant figure. He is meant to stand in for any of us, We are invited to share his memories, times he dreamed he sat by the fire, wore his winter dressing gown, or walked the streets at night. We are asked to recall our own dreams that felt seamlessly real until the alarm rang or the light changed. The examples are familiar, domestic, ordinary, which makes the subsequent doubt feel strangely close to home. Another difference lies in how Descartes isolates dreaming. Whereas earlier thinkers grouped dreams with other misleading conditions, Descartes emphasizes what makes them uniquely dangerous. A dream is not just another way in which perception can be slightly off. It is a whole environment, a complete surrounding world, that can imitate waking life down to the smallest detail. When you have a realistic dream, there may be no clue from within that anything is amiss. You are not drunk or delirious. The objects around you behave as they should. Your own thoughts and actions seem normal. Everything conspires to present this as reality. That is why, he suggests, dreams pose a distinct threat to our claims to know the external world. There is also, in Descartes' case, a more personal layer that has fascinated later readers. Biographers report that as a young man, he had a sequence of intense dreams that he took to be meaningful, even prophetic. Whether or not these reports are literally accurate, they have colored the imagination of philosophers and historians. They hint that for Descartes, dreaming was not merely a theoretical example, but a source of genuine existential unease. Yet perhaps the most important reason his version has endured is methodological. Descartes is not content simply to point out that dreams sometimes fool us. He integrates this fact into a systematic project to doubt everything that can be doubted in order to discover something that cannot. The dream argument becomes the first great wave of this methodical skepticism. It sweeps away his reliance on the senses and leaves him, for a moment, with only the bare act of thinking itself. Later he will summon even more radical scenarios, but dreams are the gateway. Because of this role, Descartes' treatment of dreaming is both more elaborate and more ambitious than most earlier discussions. He is not just asking, how can we tell dreaming from waking? He is asking, what, if anything, can survive the possibility that all of this is a dream? This is why, despite Hobbes' complaint that the dream argument was already well known, Descartes' version has set the terms of much of the later debate. When today we wonder whether we might be in a simulation, or question the reliability of memory, or imagine our senses manipulated by technology, we are often walking paths first marked out by his meditative exploration of sleep. Behind the historical details, there is a continuous thread. Dreams have long served as mirrors for our anxiety about knowledge. In them, we encounter a world that feels solid and then vanishes. Each thinker, Plato, the skeptics, Augustine, Montaigne, Descartes reads that vanishing differently. For some, it points toward a realm of timeless truths beyond the senses. For others, it counsels humility, resignation, or a search for inner illumination. In Descartes, the dream becomes something else again, an instrument for demolition and reconstruction. By following him, we can see both the continuity with earlier traditions and the shift. What was once one example among many becomes a central engine of philosophical disturbance. And as we trace this history, a final thought emerges. When we ask, how do we know we are not dreaming right now? We are not only repeating Descartes. We are participating in a much older conversation about what it means for experience to be trustworthy at all. Dreams with their brief, intense worlds keep returning to remind us that certainty, both in philosophy and in life, is a much rarer thing than it appears when the alarm clock rings and the room comes into focus. Part 3. Skeptical Scenarios, Demons and Brains in Vats. Beyond dreaming, philosophers have imagined darker and stranger ways in which we might be deceived. If a dream can mimic a few minutes or hours of life, why not a lifetime? And if the mind can be fooled by its own internal productions, could it not also be systematically misled by something outside? It's something bent on keeping it forever in the dark. Descartes takes exactly this step when he introduces the figure of a powerful deceiver, sometimes called the evil demon. After the dream argument has shaken his trust in the senses, he pushes the doubt further. Suppose he says that there is a being with immense power and subtlety whose sole purpose is to mislead me. This being could manipulate not only my sensations, but even my reasoning. In the grip of such a scenario, nothing seems safe. Simple arithmetic, the most basic truths of geometry, even the logical rules that guide inference, everything could be part of the deception. The demon might be arranging things so that whenever I try to check my reasoning, I am gently steered back into error. If the dream argument casts doubt on what we see and touch, the demon argument threatens the very tools with which we evaluate doubt. It is a more radical form of skepticism because it severs the last lines of support that had remained firm under the pressure of dreaming. Descartes himself insists that this demon is a fiction, a deliberate exaggeration chosen to test the limits of doubt. He does not claim that such a being actually exists. Instead, he uses the idea as a kind of stress test for the mind. If a belief can withstand even the possibility of a cosmic deceiver, then perhaps it is truly indubitable. But once the demon has been imagined, it is hard to forget. The figure lingers in the philosophical imagination, reshaping itself to fit new technologies and new fears. In the 20th century, one influential descendant of this idea is the brain in a vat thought experiment. Imagine that your brain has been removed from your body and placed in a tank of life, sustaining fluid. Wires run from the brain to a vast computer that sends in signals exactly like those your senses used to receive. The computer simulates a world and the brain reacts. From the inside there is no obvious difference. You still see a sky, feel a floor, hear voice. You still carry memories of a childhood, relationships and a history. You may believe that you have hands, eyes, and a beating heart. In reality, you are a brain, alone and suspended, your only contact with anything beyond yourself, passing through a carefully controlled technological interface. The brain in a vat scenario is in many ways a technological echo of both dreaming and the demon. Like a dream, it presents us with a world that feels coherent and solid but is, in fact, generated by something other than the objects it portrays. Like the demon, it suggests that our experiences might be manipulated from outside, deliberately or accidentally. Later popular culture adds another layer with stories like The Matrix. Here human beings live their entire, conscious lives inside a computer simulation. Their bodies lie in pods, tended by machines, while their minds inhabit a virtual environment that they take to be the real world. Only a few escape, and even they are haunted by doubts. How can they be sure that the new reality they have entered is not itself another level of simulation? These scenarios resonate so strongly because they play on an intuition the dream argument already uncovered. Experience by itself does not carry a label saying real or illusory. If something can reproduce the structure of our sensory life closely enough, whether a dream, a demon, a computer, then from the first-person point of view, it will feel like reality. There is, however, an interesting difference between dreams and many of these other skeptical constructs. Dreams are a regular feature of our lives. We know from simple observation that people dream often, even if they do not always remember it. They are not hypothetical. They are a recurring actuality. By contrast, brains in Vats and global computer simulations are often presented as merely possible. We cannot point to a real Vat or a confirmed simulation. The scenarios are introduced as logical or technological possibilities, not as claims about what is actually happening, yet even this line can blur. Some thinkers have argued that, given certain assumptions about technological progress and the number of simulated versus unsimulated beings that might exist, it could be statistically likely that we ourselves are living in a simulation. On that view, the simulation hypothesis is not just a fantasy, but a serious proposal about our situation. Whether or not we find such arguments convincing, they add an extra twist. The old skeptical question, could all this be an illusion, starts to look less remote. It begins to intersect with concrete issues in computer science, neuroscience, and cosmology. Still, the main role of these scenarios for philosophy is not to persuade us that we are actually in vats or simulations. It is to clarify what, if anything, we could know if we were. Could a brain in a vat ever discover its condition? Could someone in a perfect simulation ever step beyond it, or even just raise the question in a meaningful way? Here dreams again offer a suggestive analogy. Sometimes in a dream we notice small inconsistencies, a room that shifts shape, a person who changes identity, a law of physics casually violated. These glitches can trigger lucidity. We realize, while still asleep, that this is a dream. We do not yet wake up, but our relationship to the dream world changes. We can observe it, experiment within it, perhaps even alter it. Some have imagined that life in a simulation might allow for similar moments. Strange irregularities, unaccountable coincidences, or patterns in the code of physics might hint at an underlying artificial structure. The dreamer becomes lucid. The simulated mind becomes a kind of metaphysical detective, suspecting that ordinary reality is not the whole story. Whether or not one finds such speculations appealing, they underscore a deeper point. Radical skeptical scenarios, demons, vats, simulations are not just exercises in paranoia. They probe the limits of explanation. They show how far we can stretch the idea that our experiences might float free from any straightforward relation to an external world. And they ask whether our concepts of knowledge, evidence, and justification can stretch as far. Psychologically, these ideas can be unsettling. It is one thing to acknowledge, in an abstract way, that we might be wrong about some facts. It is another to imagine that your entire world, including your own body, might be part of a vast construction, designed to keep you ignorant. And yet, like the dream argument that precedes them, these scenarios contain a more positive invitation. By loosening our grip on any one picture of reality, they encourage us to ask what, in our experience, feels most undeniable. What remains, even if we suppose the worst about our connection to an external world? For Descartes, even the evil demon could not make him doubt that he was thinking. The very act of being deceived proved that there was a subject to be deceived. In that sense, skeptical scenarios, taken to their extreme, circle back to a kind of certainty, not about tables and trees, but about the bare existence of consciousness itself. When we imagine demons or vats or simulations today, we are still exploring this boundary. We test how much weight our picture of reality can bear, and we listen for the points at which doubt, rather than dissolving everything, begins to reveal. What cannot be so easily swept away? Seen in this light, the wildest skeptical stories are not merely threats to our sense of the real. They are also tools for insight, sharpening our understanding of what it means to have any experience at all, whether in a waking world, a dream, or something stranger that we have not yet learned to name. Part 4. The Coherence Test and Real World Dreaming. Elsewhere in his project of radical doubt, Descartes circles back to the very phenomenon that first shook his confidence, the dream. After using dreams to undermine the trustworthiness of the senses, he does something surprising. He tries to reclaim a difference between dreaming and waking, not by appealing to some special feeling of reality, but by looking more carefully at the structure of our experience. The key for him is coherence. When you are awake, your experiences unfold in an ordered way. Events connect. One moment leads into the next. Your memories link what you see now with what you remember from earlier today, from yesterday, from the week before. There is a story running in, the background that keeps everything tied together. By contrast, Descartes notices that many dreams have a strangely disjointed quality. You stand in your childhood home and then, without crossing any hallway, you find yourself in a city you have never visited. A friend appears beside you as if teleported. The plot bends, breaks, and reforms with little warning. If dreams are like this, he suggests, then we do have at least a practical way to distinguish sleeping from waking, the coherence test. The coherence test is, at heart, very simple. Ask yourself, does my current experience fit smoothly into a larger, continuous chain of events and memories? Does it connect with what happened a few minutes ago, an hour ago, yesterday, in a way that makes sense? If the answer is yes, then Descartes thinks you can be reasonably confident that you are awake. Notice that this is not a magical proof. It does not claim that dreaming and waking are separated by some absolute, infallible mark. It is more modest. It says, for everyday purposes, the fact that waking life tends to be stitched together, while dreams tend to be patchwork, can guide us. Dream skepticism may haunt philosophy, but perhaps we can safely ignore it when catching the bus, writing a letter, or tending a fire. This move shifts the conversation in an important way. Earlier, the dream argument relied on a kind of idealized dream, a perfectly convincing imitation of waking experience, flawless down to the smallest detail. Now Descartes looks away from these imagined perfect dreams and attends instead to real dreams as they usually are. He lets empirical features of dreaming constrain his skeptical worries. Once we follow him in this direction, the philosophical question broadens. How do dreams actually tend to feel, not in thought experiments, but in the messy lives of sleepers and insomniacs, of people who sleep deeply and those whose nights are fractured? When we pay attention to dream diaries, to reports collected in laboratories, to our own half-remembered nights, we find support for Descartes' observation: many dreams really are bizarre, discontinuous, and only weakly connected to our waking concerns. But not all of them. There are dreams that are eerily coherent. You might dream an entire day at work, complete with small frustrations, emails, and conversations. You might dream a long journey in which every step, every turn, seems to follow logically from the last. There are also so-called false awakenings in which you dream that you have woken up, gotten out of bed, checked your phone, made coffee, perhaps even begun getting ready for the day, only to discover, sometimes with a second awakening, that none of it happened. In such dreams, the coherence test itself appears inside the dream. You may think back over the last few minutes, remember getting into bed, feel your feet on the floor, and conclude that everything is as it should be. The narrative hangs together, the memory chain is intact, and yet you are asleep. This possibility worried Descartes' critics. If you can dream of passing the coherence test, then the test is not fail-safe. The threat of deception returns in a new form. You can be mistaken not only about trees and tables, but about the very structure of your experience. You can seem to yourself to be engaged in sober critical reflection, while in fact you are drifting through a vivid fiction. Our own age adds further complications. Neuroscience and dream research suggest that certain kinds of reasoning really are rare during sleep. We do not often question our surroundings while dreaming. When we do, the dream may begin to shift toward what is called lucid dreaming, where the dreamer knows, within the dream, that they are dreaming. From this, some have drawn a new introspective criterion. If you find yourself calmly able to reflect, to test, to doubt, you probably are awake. Yet the word probably matters. Dreams are not uniform. Some contain attempts at reasoning that look, in hindsight, almost comically broken. A dream, self may try to check the time, may notice inconsistencies, may reach strange conclusions that seemed perfectly rational a moment ago. These flickers of critical thought blur the line that the coherence test tries to draw. If reasoning in dreams can exist, but be subtly corrupted, then using your current sense of rational clarity to decide whether you are awake is precarious. And then there are the cases where the confusion spills beyond sleep. People sometimes wake up and, for a brief but powerful interval, remain convinced that the dream was real. They may accuse a partner of something that only happened in a nightmare, or act on the belief that a long-lost friend has returned. In those moments, the dream has successfully invaded waking life, not as an experience, but as a belief. Here the coherence test looks less like a sharp tool and more like a habit that takes time to reassert itself. You wake in the dark, heart racing, images still vivid. Slowly you gather fragments, the familiar room, the soft hum of distant traffic, the knowledge of where you are. You tell yourself that it was just a dream, and as more pieces of waking context fall into place, the dream is reclassified. The earlier conviction that it really happened dissolves. Philosophically, these edge cases are important. They show that dream deception is not merely a refined puzzle for the study or the seminar room. Under the right conditions after trauma, under medication, in certain sleep disorders, the capacity of dreams to mislead can become a live problem. People can struggle to sort memory from dream, fact from nocturnal fiction. The skeptical scenario brushes against everyday vulnerability. At the same time, these cases reveal something reassuring. What rescues us, finally, is not a single inner test, but the gradual reweaving of coherence at a larger scale. Waking life is held together not just by how things seem moment by moment, but by patterns of ongoing interaction with other people, with places, with a shared world. It is this extended mesh of expectations and confirmations that dreams, however vivid, rarely match. So where does this leave Descartes' coherence test? It is not a strict criterion that could convince a ruthless skeptic who insists on absolute certainty. You could always be dreaming of coherence, dreaming of passing the test, dreaming of your own confidence. But as a reflection drawn from the phenomenology of real-world dreaming, it still has weight. It points us toward the way that perception, memory, and narrative interlock in wakefulness, and how easily that stitching comes loose in sleep. More deeply, it hints at a shift in method. Rather than asking only what is logically possible, could I be a brain in a vat? We also ask what is psychologically and empirically typical. What are dreams like, as they are actually lived by humans with nervous systems like ours? How fragile is our grasp on reality in practice, and how often does it fail? From this angle, dream skepticism becomes less a purely abstract menace and more a spectrum of vulnerabilities. Sometimes we are firmly anchored, sometimes we drift. And sometimes, especially on the borders of sleep, we stand in a fog where the coherence of our world is still in the process of assembling itself. The coherence test then is not a final word on the difference between dreaming and waking. It is a reminder of the central role played by memory, narrative, and continuity in our sense that we are awake. To question that role is to open up deeper inquiries about what consciousness is across time, about how fragile our stories of ourselves may be, and about whether the very idea of a continuous self depends on the same stitching that dreams so easily unpick. Part 5. The logical denial of dream experience. Some philosophers, pushing the dream problem in an unexpected direction, have wondered whether dreams are experiences at all. Not whether they are real in the sense of corresponding to an external world, but whether there is, during sleep, any conscious stream to correspond to what we later report as dreams. If this radical proposal were true, it would overturn a familiar starting point. Descartes, and almost everyone after him, takes for granted that to dream is to undergo some kind of conscious state, images, sounds, emotions unfolding while the body lies still. The skeptic's sting comes from the idea that these dream experiences can be indistinguishable from waking ones. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if sleep, in its deepest sense, is the absence of consciousness, and what we call dreams are only stories constructed after the fact? One way to motivate this view is to focus on the concept of sleep itself. When we say that someone is sound asleep, we mean that they are cut off from the world, unresponsive, not aware of what is happening around them. If we then insist that they are nonetheless having vivid experiences, full of fear or delight, we seem to stretch the ordinary notion of sleep. Perhaps the argument goes, it makes more sense to tie consciousness conceptually to wakefulness, to say that where there is genuine awareness, there is, by definition, some degree of being awake. On this line of thinking, reports like "I had a terrifying dream" are not evidence that there was a conscious episode during the night. They are, instead, peculiar kinds of retrospective statements. The only criterion we ever have for someone's having dreamed is that, after waking, they tell us that they did. There is no direct access to nocturnal experience, only to morning testimony. This thesis invites a comparison. If someone says, "Last night, while I was awake, I heard a loud noise and felt afraid," we can imagine checking this. We might have a recording of the noise. We might have observed their startled reaction. Their report fits into a web of possible observations. But if someone says, "Last night, while I was asleep, I heard a loud noise in my dream and felt afraid," there is no similar network of confirmations. The sentence carries the same grammatical shape, yet it does not hook into our practices of verification in the same way. From here, the skeptic about dream experience presses a bold conclusion. The fact that someone sincerely says, "I dreamt that I was on a ship in a storm," does not entail that there was, during the night, an inner movie of a storm, waves, and ship decks. The report may express something like a spontaneous narrative or image that arose as they were waking. In this view, talk of what it was like in the dream is not literally a description of a past inner state. It is part of a distinctive language game with its own rules and functions. This move is, at bottom, conceptual. It does not deny that people lie in bed, that their eyes move under closed eyelids, that their brains show complex patterns of activity. It does not deny that people can be woken and will sometimes describe rich scenes. It questions whether, given how we actually use words like dream, experience, and conscious, it makes sense to say that there is a hidden nocturnal theatre at all. If this seems strange, it is because it runs against a deep intuition. When you recall a dream, you often feel that you are remembering something you really lived through. The fear, the embarrassment, the delight of flying feel as if they belong to a genuine episode in your biography. To be told that this is a mere way of speaking, that nothing like that ever actually occurred, can feel like being told that part of your own past has been erased. Yet the conceptual critic might respond, "Notice how shaky your access to that past really is. You rarely remember entire dreams. The fragments you do recall change as you tell them, becoming more polished, more coherent, more like stories. You often fill in gaps without noticing that you are doing so. You forget dreams quickly unless you deliberately write them down." All this suggests that the phenomenon we are dealing with is, from the start, entwined with memory and narrative construction. There are also familiar puzzles about how to count or identify dreams. If you wake 3 times in a night and report 3 different dreams, were they parts of one long dream or 3 separate ones? Is a jumbled series of fleeting images a dream, or does a dream require a certain minimum of structure and duration? Our ordinary criteria are loose. We rely on rough agreement in judgment, not on precise measurement. From such looseness, some philosophers inferred that it is misguided to treat dreams as a straightforward domain of inner events, like a hidden cinema whose reels we simply cannot replay. Instead, they suggest dream is best seen as a role in our language and practices, a way of grouping certain reports, feelings, and behaviors that cluster around sleep. To ask what really happened during sleep, beyond what can in principle be checked, is to mistake a question about our concepts for a question about an invisible realm of private happenings. If one accepts this picture, an interesting consequence follows for dream skepticism. The classical Cartesian worry depends on the idea that dream experience and waking experience share a common forms. Both are conscious episodes, differing only in their relation to an external world. But if there is no such thing as genuine dream experience, if all we have are waking constructions we call dream reports, then the dream cannot serve as a model of deceptive perception. We are not missiled during sleep, because there is no sleeping mind to be missiled. On this radical view, the silence of deep sleep extends across the whole night. Consciousness blinks off when we go under and blinks on when we wake. In between there is only physiology and, perhaps, unconscious information processing. The dream argument thus fails not because we can reliably tell dream from waking, but because it rested on a mistake about what dreams are. Still few today are willing to go this far. One reason is that the denial of dream experience sits uneasily with an accumulating body of empirical work. We can, for instance, correlate specific patterns in brain activity with later reports of dreaming. We can induce certain kinds of dream content by playing sounds or delivering mild stimuli during sleep. We can even train lucid dreamers to communicate in simple codes of eye movements from within ongoing dreams. These findings suggest that something more than mere waking fabrication is going on. Another reason is that the conceptual argument itself may be too strict. It treats meaningful talk about dreams as legitimate only if it can be tied to independent observations in a very rigid way. But many of our psychological concepts of feelings, moods, images, thoughts work with softer criteria. We do not demand a behavioral test for every report of inner life. We weigh sincerity, context, consistency over time, and fit with what else we know. From a more relaxed perspective, it can be entirely sensible to say that someone had an experience in sleep, even if we cannot inspect that experience directly. We treat their reports not as infallible windows into a private realm, but as defeasible, revisable pieces of evidence about what their mind was doing. In this way, we keep faith with ordinary usage while acknowledging its limits. The attempted logical denial of dream experience, then, is important even if we ultimately reject it. It forces us to notice how much of our confidence about inner life rests on the ways we talk, remember, and tell stories about ourselves. It reminds us that the boundary between what really happened in consciousness and what we now construct in reflection is not always clean. Perhaps the philosophical moral is not that dreams are mere fictions, but that our grip on our own mental history is always partial. We reconstruct as much as we recall. We infer as much as we directly know. Dreams highlight this human condition because they occur, if they occur, in a state we cannot inhabit with full reflective clarity. By the time we can think about them, they are already past, already filtered through waking concepts. So when someone insists that dreams are not, in any strict sense, experiences, they are pointing to a genuine tension between the immediacy with which dreams feel remembered and the fragility of the evidence that they ever unfolded, as we say. Even if we ultimately affirm that dreams are a kind of consciousness, the objection lingers as a caution. It asks us to handle our own reports gently, to remember that memory, language, and theory all play a role in shaping what we take the night to have been like. In this way, the logical denial of dream experience becomes less a final verdict and more a mirror. It reflects back our uncertainty about where consciousness begins and ends, about how to speak of what we were when we were not fully there to witness ourselves. Part 6. The cassette theory and memory insertion. Imagine waking with the vivid sense of having just lived through a long, intricate dream. You remember walking through a city at dusk, arguing with a stranger, hearing a train in the distance, and finally arriving at a station just as a bell rang. The sequence feels extended in time, composed of many steps. Yet, from the perspective of the clock by your bed, only a few seconds have passed since that very bell began to sound in the waking world. From puzzles like this, some philosophers and psychologists have drawn a provocative idea. Perhaps the dream you think you had over many minutes did not actually unfold while you were asleep. Perhaps instead a complex narrative, the whole walk, the argument, the approach to the station was assembled in an instant at the moment of waking, triggered by the sound of the bell. On this view, consciousness does not trace a path through an internal dream world. It simply finds, already in place, a kind of mental cassette that it plays back, as if it were a memory of an extended episode. This cassette theory of dreams does not deny that you now have a memory-like experience. You really do seem to recall a sequence of events, but it suggests that the sequence is the product of instantaneous memory insertion, not the trace of a prior conscious stream. The mind, in waking up, constructs a story and stamps it with the label "this happened while I was asleep." The metaphor of a cassette is revealing. A cassette is prepared in advance, recorded elsewhere, and then slotted into a machine to be played. Likewise, on this theory, some unconscious process during sleep might be working on emotional themes, bits of imagery, fragments of concern. When you begin to wake, that unconscious material is rapidly arranged into a narrative, compressed into a form the waking mind can grasp. What you call the dream is the playback of this quickly authored script. Part of the appeal of this theory lies in its parsimony. If we assume that dreams are full-fledged experiences occurring during sleep, then we must imagine two things: an unconscious process that generates the content, and a conscious process that presents it. But if we say that dreams are only memory insertions at waking, we need posit only the unconscious composition. consciousness enters the scene only once to receive the finished cassette. Another source of appeal comes from considering how fallible memory is more generally. Even in waking life, we routinely confabulate, that is, we unintentionally fill in gaps in our memories with plausible details. We remember having said things we only meant to say. We recall events in a more logical order than they really occurred. We merge separate episodes into a single story. Our sense of having lived through a particular sequence is often a reconstruction, guided by what seems reasonable or emotionally satisfying now. If waking memory can be this creative, the cassette theorist asks, why not dream memory as well? And if we cannot, in general, use later recall to distinguish between a genuinely lived experience and a cleverly constructed fiction, why should we assume that dream reports point back to a sleeping consciousness rather than to a waking storyteller? Historical anecdotes deepen the mystery. People have described dreams in which a lengthy, dramatic scenario seems to build toward a climactic moment that coincides precisely with a stimulus from the outside world, a sudden noise, a touch, a fall. The falling of a headboard, the slamming of a door, the ringing of an alarm clock appears in the dream narrative as the culmination of a long chain of events. This raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the entire chain was generated in the instant between the stimulus and full awakening, then retrospectively stretched out in imagined time. The cassette theory invites us to reconsider the phenomenology of dreaming with fresh suspicion. When you say, "I dreamed for hours," what exactly are you tracking? You are not perceiving clock time during sleep. You are reporting how long the remembered sequence feels. But felt duration can be an artifact of narrative complexity. A richly detailed story can seem longer than a sparse one, even if both are constructed in the same brief moment. From a philosophical standpoint, the cassette theory is a direct challenge to the idea that dreams provide a clear case of offline consciousness, a stream of experience detached from the present environment. If dreams are only waking constructions, then we do not have, in them, an independent mode of experience by which to test theories of perception, imagination, or selfhood. We have instead an especially vivid example of how the mind can invent a past for itself at high speed. This picture has unsettling consequences for personal identity. Much of who you take yourself to be is shaped by what you remember having lived through. If some of those memories are really cassettes inserted at the threshold of waking narratives that never corresponded to an actual conscious past, then a portion of your mental autobiography is fictional in a deep sense. You are, in part, the author of a life you never actually experienced moment by moment. At the same time, the cassette theory fits uncomfortably with certain empirical findings. When researchers wake people repeatedly during specific stages of sleep, they often obtain reports of ongoing dream experience that seem to pick up where earlier reports left off. The continuity of themes, settings, and characters across these awakenings suggests that something structured may be unfolding during sleep itself. Moreover, techniques such as lucid dreaming training allow dreamers to send signals such as prearranged eye movements from within a dream that match, in real time, the actions they say they performed. A strict cassette view must either reinterpret these data as illusions of continuity and control, or concede that at least some dreams involve genuine conscious episodes extending through sleep. In practice, many who are attracted to memory insertion ideas end up with hybrid positions. Perhaps some dreams are largely constructed at waking, while others are more faithfully tied to sleeping experience. The night on this picture is a spectrum of possibilities rather than a single uniform state. Beyond the technical dispute, the cassette theory gestures toward a broader insight about mind and time. Consciousness does not merely ride along the present moment, it incessantly reweaves the past. Each time you recall a dream, you risk changing it, emphasizing certain parts, dropping others, smoothing the narrative curve. Over weeks and years, a handful of intense dreams may be polished into almost literary episodes, bearing only a faint resemblance to the raw experiences from which they began. Seen this way, the cassette is not only a thought experiment about instantaneous insertion, but a metaphor for the larger process by which we curate our own mental histories. We continuously insert, delete, and rearrange segments of our remembered life, sometimes deliberately, often without noticing. Dreams, with their blurred boundaries and rapid decay, make this process visible in compressed form. Even if we eventually decide that dreams do involve experiences during sleep, the cassette theory leaves a lasting mark on how we interpret dream reports. It warns us that the flow we seem to recall may be more like a narrative fresco than a documentary recording. It nudges us to ask, how much of what I am now replaying was actually lived, and how much was supplied later by a mind that cannot stand gaps? There is also a more comforting angle. Suppose some of your most disturbing dreams, the nightmares that haunt you with guilt or shame, were never actually endured as long or as vividly as you now remember. Suppose they were, in part, the productions of a waking self trying to make sense of scattered emotional traces. This does not erase their impact, but it softens the thought that you were condemned for hours on end to a private hell. The suffering may be, to some degree, a creation of the present self-storytelling. In the end, the cassette theory and the idea of memory insertion do not so much solve the mystery of dreams as recast it. They shift our attention from the question, what is going on in the sleeping mind, to the equally profound question, what is the waking mind doing when it claims to remember its sleep? Between those two questions lies a vast terrain of predictive brains, of reconstructive memory, of selves who are always arriving, late to their own lives, and trying, quickly, to piece together what must have happened in the dark. Part 7. The Empirical Defense of Conscious Dreaming. In laboratories around the world, people fall asleep on purpose. Electrodes cling to their scalp and face. Straps record the rise and fall of their breathing. Their eyes close, the lights dim, and the room grows quiet. Outwardly nothing much happens. Inwardly an entire drama begins. For most of history, the reality of that inner drama was taken for granted. Of course dreams are experiences people thought. We live through them. We feel them. Only in the last century did a serious philosophical doubt emerge. Perhaps some suggested nothing truly happens in sleep, Perhaps the dream is only a story the waking mind tells afterward, stitching together fragments of memory and expectation. On this view, what you call your dream is like a cassette pressed into your mind as you wake, a ready-made narrative inserted into memory. If that were true, then consciousness might vanish in sleep and return with a counterfeit history. The problem is that from the inside, it does not feel counterfeit. We remember being there. We remember doing things, fearing things, desiring things. The question is whether there is any way to move beyond how it feels and to test empirically whether dreams are genuine experiences unfolding during sleep. Modern sleep science has tried to do exactly this. The first breakthrough came from a simple observation: sleep is not a single, uniform state. When researchers began to measure brain activity across the night, they noticed repeating stages. Slow, heavy waves appeared in some phases. In others, the signal became fast and low in voltage, more like waking than like rest. During those lively phases, the eyes darted rapidly beneath closed lids while the body's muscles went limp. This became known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. When people were woken during REM, they often reported vivid, elaborate dreams, rich scenes, intense emotions, coherent if strange narratives. When they were woken from other stages, they still sometimes reported mental activity, but it tended to be fragmentary, repetitive, or more like wandering thoughts than full, blown experiences of a world. The difference in reports tempted scientists to equate REM with dreaming. Wake someone from REM and you reveal the dream that was just occurring. Over time, this simple equation became less secure. Dreams can appear in all stages of sleep. They are more frequent and more vivid in REM, but not confined to it. Still, the basic pattern matters. Certain kinds of brain activity line up with a higher likelihood of rich, world-like experience. The sleeping brain does not shut down, it reorganizes itself. It cycles through patterns, some of which, especially those resembling waking patterns, tend to be accompanied by the sense of being somewhere. Taken alone, this correlation might not satisfy a skeptic. Brain waves are not dreams. They are, at best, the stage lighting, not the play itself. To bridge that gap, we need to show that something is happening in real time in the mind of the sleeper, something that can be tracked from the outside while it unfolds within. Lucid dreaming offered a remarkable way to attempt this. In a lucid dream, the dreamer becomes aware, within the dream, that they are dreaming. They may still see impossible things, but they know, in that moment, that the scene belongs to sleep. Crucially, some lucid dreamers can decide to do specific actions in their dreams. They can agree, while awake, to perform a certain signal once they become lucid. Researchers made a simple but profound request. Once you realize you are dreaming, move your dream eyes left, right in a pre-arranged pattern. Because the muscles that move the eyes are not completely paralyzed in REM, such movements can be picked up through electrodes. If during sleep a person's eye signals trace that exact pattern, and if afterward they report having become lucid and having sent the signal, then we have a thread connecting inner experience to outer measurement. That thread has been repeatedly observed. Sleepers signal their lucidity from within the dream. While this happens, Their brain activity shows features of both waking and REM sleep. Areas associated with self-reflection and volition light up as if awareness is partially reintroduced into the dream. The eye movements appear on the recording precisely when the dreamer claims to have made them. In some experiments, dreamers count, sing, or perform simple actions, and the timing is compared to the same tasks while awake. The durations roughly match, sometimes even running a little slower in the dream, as if time still flows, but with a different texture. All of this strongly suggests that lucid dreams are not just retroactive stories, they are lived episodes during sleep, with a structure that can be probed while they occur. If consciousness can be present and responsive in lucid dreams, it becomes harder to maintain that it is entirely absent in non-lucid ones. Perhaps lucidity is a special case, but it does show that the sleeping mind can host ongoing, reportable experience. A third piece of evidence comes from those whose dreams break free of their usual bodily confinement. In most of us, REM sleep is accompanied by a near-complete paralysis of the major muscles. We are, thankfully, unable to act out the dreams we are having. In some people, however, this paralysis fails. They thrash, kick, shout, leap from the bed. They may appear to be fighting off invisible attackers or running from unseen dangers. When these people are gently woken and asked what they were dreaming, their reports often match their movements. The man striking at his nightstand was fighting an intruder. The woman leaping from the bed was escaping a fire. These cases, known as REM behavior disorders, are not experiments designed by philosophers, but they serve a philosophical purpose. They show that complex, outwardly observable behaviors in sleep can line up with the inner narrative reported afterward. Once again, we have a bridge from physiology and movement to subjective experience. To a determined skeptic, each of these bridges can be questioned. Perhaps lucid dreamers unconsciously move their eyes and only later construct the story of deciding to do so. Perhaps people with REM behavior disorder act first and then weave a dream to fit those actions upon waking. Perhaps the alignment between brain patterns and reports is coincidental, or at least not decisive. The difficulty is that any account of dreamless sleep with inserted memories must grow increasingly baroque to fit the accumulating details. It must explain why specific muscle activations line up with specific reported scenes. It must explain why pre-agreed signals appear only when the subject later claims to have been lucid. It must explain the regularities of sleep architecture and their relation to the richness of reported experience. The more facts we gather, the more these alternative stories begin to resemble dreams of their own possible, but strained. A more modest and natural approach is to treat dreams the way we treat waking experiences. When people under anesthesia say they felt nothing, we accept that, unless we have strong reasons to doubt it. When someone claims they were in pain, we do not demand a separate, independent measurement of their suffering before we allow it into our picture of reality. We look for convergence. We ask whether their reports align with behavior, physiology, and the broader patterns of what we know. In the case of dreaming, that convergence is striking. Brain activity, muscle tone, eye movements, and the timing of external signals all support the idea that during sleep, the mind often inhabits a stream of experience. Not always, and not in every stage, and not with the same clarity we find in lucid dreams, but often enough, and in ways that fit together. This does not remove every philosophical doubt. No experiment can get behind your own subjectivity and verify from a God's eye view that your dream truly occurred. Yet that demand is inhumanly high. We do not apply it to waking life, and if we did, our entire world would dissolve into skepticism. Instead, we operate with a gentler standard, the best explanation of the available evidence. From that perspective, the empirical defense of conscious dreaming is not a proof in the mathematical sense. It is an argument about what sort of world we inhabit. Do we live in a reality where the brain, during hours of patterned, complex activity, generates no experience at all, yet somehow seeds the mind with richly structured fake memories upon waking? Or do we live in a reality where, during those hours, consciousness continues in a different mode, spinning worlds that leave their traces in the circuits we can record and the stories we later tell? The latter picture is simpler. It is also more humane. It allows us to take our own nightly lives seriously, not as infallible guides to truth, but as experiences with their own phenomenology, their own integrity in time. It suggests that when you wake from a vivid dream, you are not merely reading a cassette that someone slipped under your pillow. You are remembering a journey your mind actually took in darkness, with eyes closed, while the outside world receded. There is a quiet irony here. The dream, once a symbol of doubt about whether experience can ever be trusted, becomes, under the gaze of the sleep laboratory, one of our best cases for seeing how experience and brain activity intertwine. It reveals that consciousness does not belong only to the bright, coordinated precision of waking life. It also belongs to the drifting, unpredictable, and often private theatre we enter each night, where the evidence is subtle, but still slowly accumulates. Part 8. Dreams as Hallucinations and Virtual Reality. Beneath eyelids, an entire world can assemble itself. Streets, faces, voices, the feel of gravity as you run or fall. None of it is literally present, yet all of it is given as if it were. You do not watch your dream like a film. You stand inside it as a character among other things and people. Philosophers have long tried to classify this strange condition. One influential idea is that dreams are hallucinations in the strict sense, experiences that have the look and feel of perception, but without the appropriate link to an external object. When you hallucinate a voice in an empty room, you experience as of a sound with a location and character, even though no such sound is actually being produced. When you dream that you are walking through your childhood home, you experience the hallway, the familiar furniture, perhaps the smell of old books. But your body may be lying still in a different city, in a different decade. No hallway is currently being seen. This view tries to capture something simple but profound. When we dream, we do not usually feel as though we are imagining. We feel as though we are perceiving. The dream bedroom presents itself as the bedroom you are in now. The dream stranger appears as a person truly standing in front of you. Only when we wake do we typically reclassify these experiences, demoting them from reality to mere appearance. At the same time, psychologists sometimes hesitate to call dreams hallucinations. The term is also used for pathological waking experiences, voices in psychosis, visions in delirium, where the stakes are high and the suffering is great. To some, applying the same word to ordinary sleep seems misleading. But if we attend to the structure of the experience rather than to its clinical associations, the comparison remains appealing. Dreams are what it is like when the brain produces perception, like states, without being guided by the world. Historically, this idea is not new. Ancient thinkers already suggested that dreams arise from leftover motions in the sense organs, continuing to reverberate when external stimulation has faded. On that picture, the dream is a kind of afterimage of perception impressions echoing into the silence of sleep. Later, with Descartes, the point shifted. He emphasized how, from the inside, there may be no obvious difference between the fire one sees while awake and the fire one seems to see in a dream. If the inner texture can be the same while the outer reality changes, then experience alone cannot guarantee truth. More recent philosophers have tried to be more precise. They note that dreams share with perception a particular kind of presentness. In both, we feel located in a world that surrounds us. There is a horizon of what we could attend to next, a sense that if we turned our head, more would appear. This is unlike daydreaming, where we often know we are merely thinking about something, not inhabiting it. It is also unlike ordinary imagery, where the scene often feels faint, under our voluntary control, and easily replaced. On the strongest version of the hallucination view, dreaming and waking perception do not just feel similar, they are structurally identical. The brain builds a model of a world and a self within it, with coherent spatial relations, objects that persist, and a subject who moves through them. In waking life, that model is tightly constrained by sensory input. In dreaming, the input is largely shut off, yet the model building continues, now driven from within. This is where the metaphor of virtual reality becomes illuminating. In a technological virtual reality, a headset and controllers feed carefully prepared signals into your senses. Your brain assembles these into an environment you can explore. The world you experience inside the headset may not resemble the room you are physically in, but to the conscious mind, it is no less immediate. The philosopher who sees dreaming as a kind of biological virtual reality is suggesting that consciousness always works like this. It is always a world simulation. The only question is how tightly that simulation is anchored to the current environment. Neuroscience lends some support to this picture. During REM sleep, brain regions involved in visual processing, motor imagery, and emotion become highly active, sometimes even more active than in ordinary waking perception. At the same time, parts of the frontal lobes associated with critical reflection, working memory, and self-monitoring tend to quiet down. The result is a state where rich sensory scenes are generated, but the ability to question them or to notice their impossibility is weakened. If we place someone in a scanner and let them drift into sleep, patterns emerge. When they later report dreams dominated by movement and vivid images, their motor and visual areas often show corresponding activity. When they describe emotionally charged nightmares, regions linked to fear and arousal tend to be involved. One remarkable line of research has even used patterns of brain activation during early sleep to predict, above chance, what categories of objects the sleeper will later report having seen. This does not prove that dreaming and perception are entirely the same. It does show that, in both cases, the brain recruits similar machinery to construct a world. Whether the source of that construction is external sensory input or internal noise, prediction, and memory, the conscious result can feel perception-like. Yet the virtual reality metaphor must be handled with care. Dreams are wildly heterogeneous. Some are cinematic, richly detailed, and immersive. Others are little more than brief thoughts, flashes of image, or disjointed scenes that never quite stabilize into a coherent world. People often report that dream images lack the crispness, color saturation, and depth of waking sight. Touch, taste, and smell can be surprisingly rare. Logical continuity is fragile. One person turns into another, a house becomes a ship. The narrative jumps without warning. Moreover, the brain systems involved in imagination overlap heavily with those involved in perception. When you vividly picture an object with your eyes closed, similar visual areas light up, as when you actually see it. So pointing to shared neural circuits is not enough to say that dreams are perception rather than imagination. They may lie somewhere between, drawing on both. Interesting nuances emerge when we look more closely at how we move our eyes in different mental states. When we track a moving object in the real world, our eyes perform smooth, continuous movements that keep the target centered. When we merely imagine such an object without actually seeing it, our eye movements tend to be more jerky and fragmented. Some studies with lucid dreamers suggest that in at least some dreams, the eyes move more like they do in real perception, as if the dreamer is scanning a stable environment. Others argue that these movements might themselves help generate the imagery rather than respond to it. All of this points toward a layered picture. Some dreams are very much like waking hallucinations, perception like experiences without external objects. Others are closer to unbound imagination, a flow of thoughts lightly dressed in sensory clothing. Still others mingle elements of both. Calling dreams hallucinations is useful if we mean to emphasize their world, presenting character, the way they place us in an as-if-real environment. But we should not assume that this character is fixed or uniform. The virtual reality metaphor, too, extends beyond dreams. If consciousness itself is the brain's ongoing construction of a world simulation, then waking life is a kind of online virtual reality, constantly updated and corrected by sensory input. Dreams would then be what happens when that world simulation runs offline without many external checks. The same machinery spins and re-spins its models, driven by memory, emotion, and the brain's own restless need to predict. Seen this way, the philosophical shock of the dream argument deepens. The worry is no longer just that you might be dreaming right now instead of being awake. It is that, even while awake, you might inhabit a reality that is structurally similar to dreaming, an internal simulation kept in approximate alignment with the world, but never identical to it. The hallucination is not a rare deviation from normal perception. It is perception pushed to its limit, freed from its anchors. And yet, there is also a quiet reassurance here. If both dreaming and waking are versions of the same underlying process, then dreams are not alien intrusions into our mental life. They are natural expressions of how the mind works when it is left largely to itself. They show us, in an exaggerated form, what consciousness is always doing, inventing a here, and now a self, and a world in which that self moves. Calling dreams hallucinations or virtual realities is not meant to diminish them or to deny their emotional and existential weight. It is meant to remind us that, in sleep, we witness the mind's capacity to make worlds from almost nothing. When you wake from a vivid dream, you step from one reality model into another. The question of which one is real may be less straightforward than we like to think. The more modest question is how these models are built and what they reveal about the kind of beings who live inside them. Part 9. The Somatic Theory and Dream Illusions. From bodily whispers, entire dreamscapes can grow. A slight chill under the blanket becomes a wind howling through a deserted street. The pressure of a full bladder becomes a frantic search for a bathroom in a maze-like building. The distant sound of an alarm folds itself into the dream as a siren, a bell, a ringing phone that never quite gets answered. Experiences like these invite a different way of thinking about dreams, not as pure hallucinations without any external source, but as illusions. An illusion, in the philosophical sense, is a misperception of something that really is there. A straight stick looks bent in water. A red light seems closer than it is through fog. The world is still being sensed, but it is being misread. If some dreams work this way, then parts of the sleeping world continue to influence us, even as we spin our own narratives. The idea that dreams have bodily or external sources has a long history. Ancient healers sometimes treated dreams as diagnostic tools. In certain healing temples, patients would sleep in the hope of receiving a dream that revealed the state of their body. The images and sensations of the night were read as clues to hidden illnesses, as if the body were speaking in symbols. The dream became a kind of internal report, distorted but meaningful. Philosophers, too, speculated about the bodily roots of dreaming. Some suggested that indigestion, fevers, or changes in blood flow could give rise to strange nocturnal imagery. If you went to bed too full, you might dream of heaviness, confinement, or overwhelming forces. If you were cold, you might dream of danger, pursuit, or abandonment. Bodily sensation, on this view, is not turned off in sleep. It continues, often muffled, and the dreaming mind tries to make sense of it. By the 19th century, this simple idea was being developed into more systematic theories. Some thinkers proposed that specific dream themes could be mapped to specific bodily conditions. Flying dreams, for instance, were sometimes linked to the feeling of one's feet not touching the ground because of certain sleeping positions. Dreams of falling might reflect a sudden muscle jerk as the body relaxes. Dreams of suffocation or being trapped might track the shallow breathing of someone lying face down. Others focused on movement or its absence. They noticed how common it is to dream of trying to run but not being able to move, or of struggling to speak and finding that no sound comes out. Perhaps they suggested these dreams arise because in REM sleep the muscles are effectively paralyzed. The brain may send out motor commands, but the body does not respond. The mind, sensing this failure, clothes it in images of effort and frustration. At first, such ideas were mostly based on anecdote. Then researchers began to test them more systematically. They gently disturbed sleeping subjects with stimuli, a flash of light, a sound, a brief spray of water on the skin, a warm or cold object applied to the body, a slight electric tingling, the inflation of a blood pressure cuff around a limb. Later they woke the subjects and asked what, if anything, they had been dreaming. Patterns emerged. A spray of water on the hand might be woven into a dream as rain or as someone spilling a drink. A sudden sound might appear as a door slamming, a gunshot, or an explosion. The pressure of the blood pressure cuff around. The leg could transform into dreams of tight boots, heavy chains, or even more elaborate scenarios, a leg trapped under rubble, a limb being examined or injured. The external stimulus did not dictate a single dream. It was interpreted, expanded, and folded into whatever narrative the sleeping brain was already constructing. From the standpoint of illusion, these examples are telling. There is a real stimulus, a sound, a touch, a pressure. But what the dreamer experiences is not an accurate perception of that stimulus. It is a misperception, often one step removed. The alarm clock is heard as a fire siren. The cold air is felt as winter on a battlefield. The body's quiet signals are amplified and reshaped into scenes. Muscle activity plays a similar role. Even in healthy REM sleep, the body is not perfectly still. Small twitches, jerks, and brief movements occur. In some cases, these movements appear to mirror dream actions, a hand flexing as the dreamer grasps an object, a leg kicking during a dream of running. In other cases, the causal direction may be reversed. A spontaneous twitch in the arm could prompt the dream of throwing a punch or of brushing against something. The relation is complex and likely runs both ways. These phenomena show that the wall between the sleeping mind and the external world is thinner than we might think. Dreams do not float in a vacuum. They are shaped, at least sometimes, by the body's ongoing state and by events in the environment. The key question is how far to push this insight. Historically, some advocates of what came to be called the somatic stimulus theory made a bold claim that dreams in general are caused by bodily or external stimuli. On this strong view, if we could track every tiny change in the sleeper's body and surroundings, we could, in principle, explain the content of every dream as a response, distorted, translated, but still traceable to those changes. The mind would add associations and memories, but the driving force would be physical triggers. Today the stronger claim looks unlikely. Too many dreams seem unconnected to any obvious external event. We dream of ancient memories, abstract conversations, impossible architectures. We revisit childhood homes long after the body has settled comfortably into bed. Even in experiments with carefully timed stimuli, the resulting dream images can be indirect, symbolic, or merged with concerns and themes from the dreamer's life that far exceed the original trigger. What the evidence supports, more modestly, is that external and bodily stimuli can play a variable role in shaping dream content. Sometimes they are incorporated in a way that fits the classic notion of illusion. The real stimulus is present, but perceived as something else. At other times, they serve more as seeds for associative chains, setting the mind off in directions that quickly leave the original input behind. A pressure on the leg might begin as a sense of tight shoes, then slide into a story about a long journey, which then reveals deeper anxieties or desires unrelated to the physical sensation. This more nuanced picture has interesting philosophical consequences. If some dreams are illusions in the narrow sense, misperceptions of current stimuli, then even in sleep our consciousness remains lightly tethered to the world. The blanket's weight, the room's temperature, the noises in the house, the position of our limbs sigh, all of these can show up, transformed in the landscape of the dream. The simulation is not purely free, floating. It has inputs, though they are sparse and often misunderstood. At the same time, because these inputs are so easily reinterpreted, dreams reveal how much of what we experience depends on interpretation rather than raw data. The same sound might become a church bell, a gunshot, a knock at the door, or distant thunder, depending on the dream's unfolding plot and the dreamer's memories. The body offers hints. The mind spins them into stories. Seen against the backdrop of earlier chapters, the somatic theory and the notion of dream illusions add another layer to our understanding. Dreams are not just internal hallucinations, nor are they simple readings of bodily signals. They are dynamic constructions that draw on the body, the environment, memory, and emotion all at once. Sometimes the link to the body is obvious. Sometimes it is so indirect that only careful experimentation reveals it. When you wake to the sound of your alarm, only to realize that it has been ringing inside your dream for several minutes as part of a scene, you catch a glimpse of this process. The world knocked. The dream answered in its own language. Between stimulus and response, an entire narrative was born. In that gap lies much of what makes dreaming philosophically rich. It shows us a mind that is never merely passive, never merely receiving what is given. It is always translating, always misreading, always turning thin threads of sensation into thick tapestries of meaning. Whether we call those misreadings illusions or something else, they remind us that even at rest, the border between body and world, between inner and outer, remains active, quiet, but alive with possibility. Part 10. The imagination model and the will. When night gathers around the mind, a strange theatre opens. Scenes appear, conversations unfold, landscapes stretch out before us. Yet nothing stands in front of our eyes. No light enters through the senses. Whatever a dream is, it is not perception in the ordinary sense. It is a world made from within. One proposal says that dreams are, at their core, not hallucinations but acts of imagination. On this view, the dreaming mind does something closer to what we do when we daydream or when we are absorbed in a novel than to what we do when we look at a tree or listen to a voice. The dream would then be an extended episode of imagery and narrative that the mind spins for itself, a kind of involuntary fiction in which we temporarily live. Imagination, however, is usually linked to the will. To imagine, in ordinary life, is something we do. We decide to picture a friend, to rehearse a conversation, to picture a future we hope for or fear. There is effort. There is a sense of I am doing this. Perception, by contrast, feels imposed. We open our eyes and the room is simply there, whether we want it or not. Dreaming does not sit comfortably in either category. We do not decide to begin a dream. We do not choose its first setting or cast of characters. It seems to happen to us like a weather front rolling in. If dreams are imagination, they are a kind of imagination that slips free of the conscious will. They resemble a story we are both telling and being told, without having chosen the plot. To get a feeling for this, think of the way a powerful novel can swallow your attention. You know the book is not real, yet for a while you inhabit its world. You feel present in its rooms, gripped by its events. The words on the page are thin, but the inner scene is thick. Some philosophers suggest that dreaming is closer to this kind of absorption than to standing in a physical place. We are not located in a world so much as lost in a narrative. But here an important difference appears. When you close the book, you leave the story. You can decide to put it down, to stop imagining the faces and rooms. In a dream, you rarely have that option. The equivalent of closing the book is waking up, and waking is usually outside your control. You can shout, you can struggle, you can decide that enough is enough. But if the dream does not release you, you stay. Lucid dreaming complicates this picture. In a lucid dream, you realize that you are dreaming while still inside the dream. Sometimes this realization brings with it a sudden sense of freedom. You can choose to fly, to change the setting, to confront a nightmare figure and watch it dissolve. The will reappears inside the dream, taking hold of the very fabric of the imagined world. This suggests that dreams are not wholly beyond control, but rather that control can fade in and out. If we treat lucid dreams as special cases of imagination, they show that the dreaming mind can, at least sometimes, steer its own images. Yet even in lucid dreams, much remains spontaneous. Backgrounds fill themselves in. Characters say unexpected things. One part of the mind seems to generate material while another part shapes and responds to it. Imagination and will do not collapse into each other, they interweave. Think also about how sketch-like many dreams are. We remember vivid fragments, the friend, the falling sensation, the narrow hallway, but not the details we would expect from waking perception. Often, when we look back, the world of the dream seems oddly unfinished, as if only the places we looked at were ever formed. This feels closer to imagination than to perception. When we picture a house in our mind asakasi, we may see the front door clearly while the rooms remain merely suggested. Questions about colour in dreams reveal this further. People once reported dreaming mostly in black and white, then later mostly in colour, shifting alongside changes in media. It is unlikely that the very structure of dreaming changed. More plausible is that dreams are often indeterminate about such details, and that we later fill them in according to what we expect a vivid scene to be like. Imagination, too, can be vague in this way. We may imagine a tree without deciding whether its leaves are glossy or dull, yet still call the image clear. If dreams share this indeterminate, sketch-like quality with imagination, they may be better understood as a special mode of imagining rather than as failed perception. On this view, the sleeping brain is not receiving a world, but composing one with just enough structure to support the unfolding story. Only what matters for the narrative becomes fully formed. The rest stays hazy, ready to be sharpened if attention turns toward it. What then becomes of the will? Perhaps our ordinary notion of will is too narrow. We often identify it with deliberate choice, with the conscious decision to act or refrain. But much of our mental life is steered by subtler currents, habits, concerns, fears, desires we hardly notice. These too exert a kind of guidance. They tilt the probabilities of what we will picture, remember, or dream. On the imagination model, dreams might express a deeper, slower will. Not the sharp "I choose this now," but the accumulated pattern of what concerns us, what we avoid, what we have not yet resolved. We do not will each event in a nightmare, but perhaps we have, over time, willed the shape of the inner world from which that nightmare is drawn. Our agency would then be diffused through the architecture of the mind, rather than focused in the moment of the dream. Seen this way, dreams sit between two poles. At one end lies passive perception, the world impressing itself upon us. At the other lies active imagination, the mind deliberately conjuring images. Dreaming is neither fully passive nor fully active. It is imagination set in motion by deeper habits and concerns, then left largely to run on its own. Now and then, as in lucid dreams, the narrower will awakens inside this flow and takes the reins for a while. When we wake, we often say the dream just happened, but perhaps that is only partly true. The dream is also something we, in a broader sense, did. It is shaped by what we have learned, feared, wanted, and rehearsed. It is imagination without full supervision, yet not without authorship. The question, then, is not whether dreams are under the will, but what kind of will we really have. From this perspective, another boundary begins to blur. If dreaming is a kind of runaway imagination, then our waking daydreams and moments of drifting thought may not be so different. When the mind wanders during a long journey or a quiet afternoon, it too produces little worlds, scenes, and voices without our explicit command. To understand dreaming, we may need to step back and ask a wider question. How much of our mental life is truly chosen at all, and how much simply unfolds unbidden, yet still ours? Part 11. Mind-wandering and mental autonomy. During wakefulness, the mind often slips its leash. You are reading a page, then realize you have no memory of the last 3 paragraphs. You are driving home along a familiar road, and suddenly notice you have been lost in thought, your hands steering while your attention wandered somewhere else entirely. These episodes are so common that we rarely pause to examine them. They are called mind-wandering, stretches of inner activity that drift away from what we are doing and from the immediate environment. In such moments, thoughts arise and unfold with minimal guidance. We rehearse arguments, revisit old scenes, anticipate futures that may never arrive. The body remains in the world, but the inner gaze looks elsewhere. Some researchers have suggested that dreams are, in essence, intensified mind-wandering. remove the constraints of the waking world, the constant interruptions, the demands of tasks, the corrections from the senses, and the wandering mind blooms into full virtual reality. What we call a dream would then be the mind, wandering system operating at maximum strength, unconstrained by incoming information. This way of thinking shifts the question. Instead of asking what makes dreams so strange, we might ask what keeps waking life so relatively stable. Perhaps it is not that dreams are wild, but that waking consciousness is unusually tethered. Sight, sounds, and bodily sensations continually pull our thoughts back, anchoring them to the present task. When that anchor loosens in boredom or fatigue, our waking thoughts begin to resemble miniature dreams. Underlying this is the idea of mental autonomy. Autonomy is the capacity to direct one's own thought processes, to decide what to think about, to sustain attention on a chosen object, to shift focus when one judges it appropriate. We like to imagine ourselves as mentally autonomous most of the time. We believe that our inner lives follow our intentions, that thinking is something we do, not something that merely happens. But mind wandering and dreaming suggest otherwise. For large portions of our days, thoughts arise without being chosen, linger without being invited, and depart without being dismissed. We do not select the next association that pops into consciousness, or the memory that suddenly pushes itself to the front of awareness. We find ourselves already thinking, as if stepping into a stream that was flowing before we noticed it. Some philosophers describe dreams and mind wandering as cases of diminished mental autonomy. They are not deliberate mental actions like deciding to solve a math problem or planning a route. Instead, they are closer to background processes such as heartbeat or breathing. We can sometimes influence them, calming our breath, nudging our thoughts, but they are not originally under our command. They happen in us more than they are done by us. This perspective can be unsettling. If most of our conscious life consists of such spontaneous, unplanned episodes, then genuine mental action may be the exception rather than the rule. Focused attention, careful reasoning, deliberate imagination, these might be islands of agency in a wide sea of unbidden experience. Our sense of being the steady author of our thoughts would then be, at least partly, an illusion nourished by those rare moments of clear control. Lucid dreaming, again, becomes a revealing laboratory. When you realize you are dreaming and begin to act with intention inside the dream, mental autonomy has returned within a largely autonomous process. You might choose to fly, to ask a question, to explore a landscape more deliberately. Yet the dream does not become empty. The environment still offers surprises. Characters still speak unexpected lines. One layer of mind wanders, another layer notices and intervenes. The same can be true in waking life. You notice that your mind has drifted during a conversation, and you gently bring it back. Or you allow yourself to wander on purpose, taking a walk and letting thoughts go where they please, while a quieter awareness monitors the flow. Spontaneity and control are not simple opposites. They can coexist in shifting proportions, like improvisation within a loose framework. Thinking of dreams as extreme mind wandering also helps with the earlier debate about what dreams are. Are they hallucinations, imaginings, some hybrid state? Perhaps this demand for a single, neat category is misguided. Mind-wandering itself comes in many forms: visual, verbal, fragmented, richly narrative. Sometimes it approaches fantasy, sometimes it merely mutters in the background. Dreams could be understood as one region in this larger landscape of spontaneous consciousness. Seen this way, the question, what is a dream, becomes less about fitting it into an existing box and more about mapping its relations. How controlled is it? How sensory-like is it? How coherent is its storyline? How does it relate to the thoughts and concerns of waking life? This more flexible view acknowledges both the uniqueness of dreaming and its continuity with ordinary mental drift. There is also a practical implication. If we overestimate our mental autonomy, we may misunderstand both ourselves and others. We might blame ourselves for thoughts that simply appeared, or assume that every inner image expresses a deliberate wish. Conversely, we might claim full authorship of insights that were largely the fruit of unconscious wandering. Recognizing the spontaneity of much mental life allows for a gentler, more accurate picture of the mind-Asaka workings. At the same time, acknowledging the limits of autonomy does not erase responsibility. We may not choose every thought, but we can shape the conditions under which patterns of thought grow. What we attend to, what we practice, what environments we inhabit, all of these influence the streams that will later wander through our sleep and our idle moments. We are gardeners of a mind that also seeds itself. Mind-wandering, then, is not just a nuisance or a failure of focus. It reveals something fundamental about us, that consciousness is an ongoing process, only sometimes steered by explicit intention. Dreams push this process into a more vivid and self-contained form, showing us what happens when the wandering becomes a world. In both cases, we live much of our lives in spaces our minds create, half-guided, half adrift. This brings us to a subtler question. When in these drifting states we realize things, fear things, or take things to be true, what is the status of those mental states? Do we really believe what we take for granted in a dream or in a wandering fantasy? Or are we only imagining that we believe? To understand the depth of dream skepticism and the nature of self-deception, we need to look more closely at the fragile line between belief and imagination in sleep. Part 12. Belief versus imagination in sleep. In dreams, we often accept the impossible without hesitation. We find ourselves talking with the dead, breathing underwater, or walking through a childhood home that has, quietly, merged with a city we have never seen. While we are dreaming, these things can feel not only vivid, but true. We take them for granted as the way things are. On waking, this confidence dissolves. We do not spend our morning convinced that we can still fly or that the laws of physics have been suspended. The beliefs of the dream, if they were beliefs, vanish without struggle. They do not need to be argued down. They evaporate the moment we open our eyes. This raises a subtle question: were those really beliefs at all? Or were they more like imagined assumptions that governed the dream world while it lasted? The distinction matters because it shapes how we understand both skepticism and self-knowledge. Beliefs in ordinary life have certain characteristic features. they are relatively stable over time. They are connected to evidence and to other beliefs in a network. They influence what we do, shaping our actions and decisions. To believe that the stove is hot is to be disposed not to touch it, to flinch as your hand nears, to explain your caution in terms of that belief. In dreams, what we accept does not behave like this. We may dream that a stranger is our closest friend, or that we live on another planet. Yet these overnight convictions do not integrate with our waking web of beliefs. They do not persist, motivate continued action, or demand revision when they conflict with what we know. They appear and disappear with the scene like props in a play. Because of this, some philosophers argue that dream beliefs are not genuine beliefs but propositional imaginings. In other words, during a dream we imagine that certain things are true and imagine ourselves reacting to them. But we do not really believe them in the way we believe that 2 + 2 is 4 or that the sun will rise tomorrow. The dream, on this view, is an immersive fiction we temporarily inhabit. This proposal has an attractive consequence for skepticism. If when we dream that we are awake, we only imagine that we are awake, then we are not literally mistaken about our situation. Our beliefs, properly speaking, remain safely anchored in waking life. The dream becomes a simulation of error rather than an actual error. Yet the matter is not so simple. From the inside, the dream does not feel like mere imagining. When you run from a threat in a nightmare, you do not experience yourself as knowingly playing a game with a fiction. You feel endangered. You feel sure for that moment that something is terribly real. To describe this later as "I only imagined it" seems to misrepresent the lived quality of the experience. There is also the possibility of deception at a deeper level. Even if the states we have in dreams fall short of full belief, we might still be mistaken about what kind of states they are. We might, in a dream, take an imaginative assumption to be a real belief. The deception would then consist not only in misrepresenting the world, but in misclassifying our own mental life. The mind would be confused, not just about where it is, but about what it is doing. A useful comparison lies in our experience of fiction while awake. Sitting in a dark cinema, we know we are watching actors on a screen. Yet another part of us flinches, grieves, or rejoices as if the events were real. We may cry for a character we know to be invented. We can describe this as a layered state, belief that this is fiction intertwined with an imaginative acceptance of the story's reality for the sake of emotional engagement. Dreams could involve a similar layering, but with a critical, distancing layer weakened or absent. We might say that the dreaming mind is under the spell of its own imagining. It entertains possibilities, and, for the duration, fails to mark them as such. In this sense, dream cognition would occupy a middle ground between clear-eyed imagining and full-dress belief. The boundary blurs even more when we consider delusions in waking life. There, too, we find states that resemble beliefs, in some respects but not others. A person might insist that their thoughts are being controlled, or that a loved one has been replaced by an impostor, yet behave in ways that only partially reflect this conviction. The debate over whether such delusions are really beliefs or some other kind of state parallels the debate about dreams. Both cases invite a more graded picture of our doxastic life, that is, of how we take things to be true. Rather than a sharp division between belief and imagination, we might think in terms of degrees and mixtures. There are robust, action-guiding beliefs. There are light, entertained possibilities, and there are in-between states where we half accept, half suspend judgment, or where acceptance is strong but poorly integrated with the rest of what we know. From this point of view, the question, do we believe in our dreams, may not admit a simple yes or no. In some dreams, our acceptance of the situation is thin and easily shaken, as when we are on the verge of lucidity. In others, our grip is firmer, and we behave as if we truly believed what the dream presents. Across the night, the strength, depth, and integration of these states may vary. What remains crucial for skepticism is that, at least sometimes, we inhabit conscious states that feel belief-like and world, revealing, yet are poorly connected to reality. Whether we label them weak beliefs or strong imaginings, they show that the mere feeling of conviction is not a guarantee of truth. It is possible to be fully convinced inside a coherent world that evaporates on waking. This realization rebounds on our waking lives. When we now feel certain that we are awake, that the room around us is real, are we drawing on anything more secure than we did in the most persuasive dream? Perhaps we are. We can test, reflect, compare experiences over time, check for coherence and consistency. But dreams remind us that the mind can generate, from within, experiences that imitate these signs of reality to a disturbing degree. At the same time, dreams also caution us against overconfidence in our self-knowledge. If we can mistake imagining for believing in sleep, we may also misread our own mental states while awake. We might take a passing fantasy to express a deep desire, or mistake a rehearsed narrative for a memory. The mind is not transparently given to itself. It interprets its own activity, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. To linger on belief and imagination in sleep is thus to confront two linked vulnerabilities. We can be mistaken about the world, and we can be mistaken about what we are doing in relation to the world. Dreams dramatize both at once. We live through worlds that are not there, under attitudes that are not quite what they seem. Where this leaves us is not in total doubt, but in a more cautious, reflective stance. Certainty becomes less a starting point and more an achievement, the product of repeated testing and mutual correction. The bright line between waking belief and dreamy imagining grows softer at the edges, and in that softened space we begin to see consciousness itself as a continual construction, sometimes firmly anchored, sometimes drifting, always capable of mistaking its own creations for the given. From here, one can turn to deeper theories of how the brain builds these constructions, models in which perception, imagination, and belief all arise from the same predictive machinery, tuned in different ways. But before we follow that path, it is worth carrying this lesson forward, that the mind is both world maker and world taker, and that in sleep, especially, we confront how easily the two can be confused. Part 13. Predictive Processing and Internalism. In recent years, a new picture of the mind has begun to take shape. It is a picture in which the brain is not a passive receiver of sensations, but an active prediction engine constantly guessing what will happen next, and then checking those guesses against whatever the senses deliver. On this view, perception is not like opening a window onto the world. It is more like inhabiting a constantly updated model, a world the brain quietly builds and rebuilds from moment to moment. The light that strikes the retina, the sound that enters the ear, the pressure on the skin, all of these are treated as clues, not as finished products. They are hints the brain uses to confirm or correct its ongoing story about what is out there. Dreaming in this framework becomes especially revealing. Here is a state in which that inner model runs almost entirely on its own, with little or no need to answer to the world outside. If waking consciousness is like a live broadcast, dreams begin to look like a private rehearsal, the cameras still running, but the connection to the outside studio largely cut. This way of thinking is often called predictive processing. The basic idea is simple, even if the implementation in the brain is complex. At all times, the brain carries a generative model, a set of expectations about what the next moment of experience should be like. These expectations cascade downward from higher to lower levels, predicting patterns of activity in the senses. The senses, in turn, send back only what does not fit prediction errors, signals that something about the current model is off. The system then has two main strategies. It can change its model to better match the incoming signals, or it can act on the world and on the body to make the incoming signals better match the model. In waking life, these two strategies blend seamlessly. You turn your head to see where a sound is coming from. You reach out to touch an object whose distance you misjudged. You blink, squint, step closer, step away. Action and perception continually cooperate to keep the inner model in line with the environment. When we fall asleep and begin to dream, much of this loop is slackened. We still have bodies, and they still generate signals. The heart beats. The lungs expand and contract. Muscles in the eyes and limbs twitch. Sounds may intrude from the bedroom. A hand may brush against the blanket. A change in temperature may be faintly registered. But the overall balance shifts. The brain's predictions become more dominant, incoming signals are down, weighted, muted, or interpreted in highly flexible ways. The inner model is now less a servant of the world and more a free, running simulation. This brings us to a long-standing philosophical dispute about experience. Is consciousness fundamentally a matter of what goes on inside the head, patterns of neural activity that could, in principle, unfold in isolation from any real environment? Or is it essentially shaped and defined by the way we are dynamically coupled to the world by our real movements, real possibilities for action, and real patterns of causal exchange with things beyond the skull? The first view is often called internalism. On this side, dreams look like powerful evidence. When you dream you are walking along a beach, feel the sand under your feet, hear the waves, smell the salt in the air. There may be no beach, no sand, no waves, no salt anywhere near your sleeping body. Yet from the inside, the experience can be rich, structured, and emotionally charged. It feels like a world. If such a world can arise when the brain is largely closed off from its surroundings, the internalist argues, then consciousness is at root a matter of how things are arranged in the brain, not of our actual relation to the environment. Some theorists take this further, suggesting that consciousness itself is a kind of world simulation, and that dreaming simply reveals this structure in its purest form. In waking life, the simulation is pinned down and constrained by constant sensory input. In dreams, those constraints loosen, and we see the generative machinery more nakedly. The mind, on this picture, is always building a subjective world for me. Sometimes that world is tightly keyed to what is actually there. Sometimes, as in dreams, it diverges. On the other side stand various forms of externalism. Here the thought is that experience is not just something the brain produces and then projects inward. It is something that essentially involves our practical grip on the world around us. To see a cup, on this view, is not simply to have a visual representation of a cup-like shape. It is to be poised to reach for it, to sip from it, to feel its weight, to anticipate what would happen if it slipped. Waking perception, the externalist says, is richly structured by these ongoing possibilities for action. Philosophers in this tradition point to the instability and fragmentariness of dreams. In dreams, scenes often shift abruptly. Objects melt, transform, or disappear. People blend into one another. You may find yourself in one location only for the entire setting to flip without transition. For the externalist, this is not an accident. It reflects the fact that, in dreaming, we are no longer engaged in real-time exploration of a stable world. The sensoromotor loops that normally anchor perception are not available in the same way. We cannot actually lean in to inspect an object, test its weight, or walk around it to see its other side. What we get instead are shifting, partly unconstrained predictions that are never fully checked. From this angle, dreaming supports the claim that neural activity alone is not enough for genuine perception. It may be enough for something, a kind of hallucination or simulation, but waking perception, with its precision and stability, is achieved only when those internal patterns are tied into the larger circuitry of world, engaging action. At first glance, the two sides seem to be talking past each other. Internalists say, look at dreams. They show you how much can be done with almost nothing coming in. Externalists say, look at the very differences between dreams and waking. They show you why the environment still matters. Under the lens of predictive processing, however, the contrast becomes less stark. For the predictive processing theorist, there is always an internal generative model. That much is shared with internalism. But this model is learned, trained, and continuously revised through interaction with the environment. Its contents and its structure are not arbitrary. They reflect a long history of embodied engagement with a particular world. When we dream, that learned model continues to operate. It still draws on the same expectations about bodies, objects, places, and social interactions that were shaped while awake. The difference is not that the environment suddenly ceases to matter altogether. It is that, in the moment of dreaming, its influence is attenuated. This can be pictured as a shift in balance between top, down, and bottom-up signals. During waking, prediction errors from the senses are treated as important and informative. They carry high weight, forcing the system to adjust its expectations when they are repeatedly violated. During many dreams, especially in rapid eye movement sleep, this weight appears reduced. The brain trusts its own expectations more, and treats discrepancies from the body and the environment as less significant. The result is a stream of experience in which unlikely combinations and impossible events are tolerated and often go uncorrected. Even here, though, the body does not entirely vanish. Subtle muscle twitches, particularly in the limbs and face, are common in sleep. Some researchers suggest that these twitches act as a kind of self-generated probesy, tiny bursts of movement whose sensory consequences help maintain and refine the brain's model of its own body. In dreams that involve flying, running, or falling, the feeling of movement may be partly anchored in these internal signals. The dream body, on this view, is not conjured from nothing. It is a model actively informed by the body's ongoing whisperings. This idea becomes even more intriguing when we consider early development. An infant spends a large portion of their time asleep. Their sensory world while awake is relatively limited and sometimes chaotic. In such a context, sleep might offer a protected arena in which the brain can experiment with its body model, triggering coordinated patterns of muscular activity, registering the resulting feedback, and slowly learning what this body can do. The dream, like states of early life, may be less about replaying daytime events and more about discovering the contours of a self that moves. Returning to the philosophical debate, what do dreams, so understood, tell us about internalism and externalism? They do show that striking forms of conscious experience can be generated when the influence of the environment is reduced. They illustrate how much of our sense of a world, of a body, of other people, is carried in the generative model itself. In that sense, they lend some support to the internalist's emphasis on the sufficiency of neural processes for at least some forms of experience. But dreams also depend deeply on a history of world involving learning. Your ability to dream of language, of cities, of complex tools, of social rituals, rests on countless waking encounters. The dreaming brain does not invent a universe. From scratch each night it recombines and transforms, under altered constraints, the materials it has previously distilled from life. For this reason, the externalist can reply that dreams do not show consciousness floating free of the world. They show, instead, how far the traces of the world penetrate into the structure of our inner models. A further complication comes from the simple fact that not all dreams are sealed off equally. Some respond in real time to sounds in the bedroom, to touch, to changes in posture, even to the rhythms of one's own breathing. There are dreams that skillfully weave an alarm clock into a storyline or transform a pressure on the chest into a narrative of being held down. Here, too, the predictive model is at work, but it is being guided gently and often in disguise by the body's contact with its surroundings. Seen through the lens of predictive processing, then the familiar opposition between internal and external begins to soften. Conscious experience, whether waking or dreaming, emerges from an ongoing negotiation between the brain's world model and the signals that reach it from the body and the environment. Dreams are the special case in which the negotiation is unequal. The model speaks more loudly, the world speaks more softly. Yet the language in which the model speaks was learned in dialogue with that world. For the ancient worry about whether we are truly awake, This offers both reassurance and unease. Reassurance because during ordinary waking life, prediction errors are plentiful. The world constantly pushes back. A misplaced step, a wrong assumption, a surprising event, all of these are reminders that we do not fully control the story. Unease because even in waking life we depend on simulations. What we experience is never the world, raw, but always the world as filtered, anticipated, and interpreted by our predictive machinery. Dreams in this story are not aberrations. They are what happens when that machinery runs with fewer constraints. To study them is to watch the mind's model, building powers loosed from the tight leash of reality. They show us, in slow motion, what is always already true, that to be conscious is to inhabit a constructed world, a world that is at once rooted in reality and shaped by the expectations we bring to it. Part 14, Madness, Psychosis and Delusion. Long before brain scans and sleep laboratories, people noticed a disturbing resemblance between certain dreams and episodes of madness. Both can involve vivid hallucinations. Both can involve impossible events taken as perfectly real. Both can shatter and reassemble identity, blurring the line between who one is and who one takes oneself to be. It is not surprising, then, that some philosophers and psychiatrists have suggested that dreaming might serve as a model system for psychosis. If we want to understand what it is like to inhabit a delusional world, to hear voices others do not hear, to be convinced of things that strike everyone else as absurd, we might learn something by looking more carefully at what happens each night when a sleeping mind constructs its own reality. Consider what it is like to be deep inside a dream. You might be standing in your childhood home, talking to someone who looks like a stranger, but whom you somehow know to be your mother. A door opens, and suddenly you are in a crowded train station in a city you have never visited. The sky is green. People walk past with animal heads. These changes rarely strike us as problems while we are dreaming. We accept them, or slide over them, or feel a brief flicker of unease that quickly dissolves. This acceptance in the face of bizarreness is one of the features that invites comparison with psychosis. In some forms of schizophrenia, people report hearing a constant stream of voices commenting on their actions. Others are convinced that strangers are really family members in disguise, or that a loved one has been replaced by an impostor. These are not mere thoughts entertained like hypotheses. They are lived certainties that shape how a person moves through the world. A familiar example is the Fregoli delusion, in which a person believes that different people they encounter are all actually one single individual, adopting various disguises. Another involves déjà vu, where a simply furnished room or a minor event feels deeply, inexplicably familiar, as though it had happened in exactly this way before. In the dreaming mind, something similar occurs. We routinely treat one dream character as another, or a new place as an old one, without needing the surfaces to match. Recognition and identity seem to follow a felt sense of familiarity rather than the stable features of faces or locations. Some philosophers argue that delusions in waking life arise when two things come together. First, there is anomalous experience, a feeling of strangeness, of hyperfamiliarity, of voices speaking that one cannot locate. Second, there is a breakdown in what is often called reality testing. The ability to check such experiences against other sources of information, to weigh them against what is plausible, to ask how they fit with the rest of what one knows. Dreaming offers a kind of laboratory version of this conjunction. Dreams supply us with abundant anomalous experiences, floating time travel, metamorphosis, uncanny doubles. At the same time, the systems that would normally challenge and correct such experiences are dampened. Critical reflection is reduced. Memory for the recent past is patchy. The sense of being an agent who can stop and question what is happening is weakened. In this mix, fantastic scenes can be taken at face value, at least for a while. Another comparison arises around the sense of agency over thoughts and actions. People in psychotic states sometimes report that their thoughts are not their own, but have been inserted into their minds from outside. They may feel that their actions are being controlled by an external force, or that their inner speech is no longer self-generated. These experiences of thought insertion or alien control are among the most puzzling in psychiatry. They show how fragile our ordinary sense of ownership over our own mental life can be. In dreams, agency can also come unmoored. You may watch yourself act from a third-person perspective, like a character in a film. You may hear your own voice, speak words you did not decide upon. Whole sequences of action may unfold without any felt moment of willing them. Sometimes the dream self-behaves in ways that shock or distress you on waking, and yet in the dream there was little sense of choice. The dream can feel both like something you are doing and something that is happening to you. This double aspect, a weakened sense of control coupled with immersion in a constructed world, helps explain why dreams have been likened to what one researcher called a healthy psychosis. The chemistry and patterns of brain activity during certain stages of sleep do, in fact, resemble some features seen in psychotic states, heightened activity in emotional and perceptual areas, with a relative dampening of regions associated with self-monitoring and rational evaluation. But there are important differences. Dreams are typically brief. They end naturally. Upon waking, most people regain a shared framework of reality they know, at least after a moment's orientation that what just happened was a dream. Psychosis, by contrast, can be enduring. It affects waking interactions, social roles, and long-term plans. Its consequences spill into every corner of life. To call psychosis a waking dream can therefore risk trivializing genuine suffering and the complex social world in which that suffering plays out. For philosophy, the point of the comparison is not to collapse these conditions into one another, but to use their resemblance carefully. Dreams provide a rare opportunity to study, from the inside, what it is like to inhabit a world whose coherence is built locally, moment by moment, rather than secured by continuous testing against a shared environment. They reveal how far the mind can go in constructing a sense of reality given only its own resources. There are also methodological questions. When we study dreams, we rely heavily on reports given after waking. The dream itself is over by the time it can be described. Memories may be incomplete or distorted. We hear the story awaking, mind tells about a sleeping one. In psychosis, by contrast, We can sometimes collect descriptions in the midst of the episode. We can observe behavior in real time and see how it interacts with the environment. The data and their limitations are different on each side. Still, the parallels between dream reports and reports from people with psychosis, especially around misidentification, hyperfamiliarity, thought insertion, and hallucinated voices, suggest that there may be partially shared mechanisms. Perhaps there are common patterns in how the brain attributes ownership to thoughts, or in how it assigns significance and familiarity to faces and places. Perhaps what varies is the degree to which these patterns are constrained by still functioning systems of memory, attention, and reality checking. From a more personal angle, reflecting on these parallels can soften crude boundaries between the sane and the mad. Almost everyone has inhabited impossible worlds in sleep without realizing it at the time. Almost everyone has accepted glaring impossibilities, only to be embarrassed by them on waking. To acknowledge that our own minds are capable of such departures from reality under perfectly ordinary conditions is not to deny the severity of psychosis. It is to recognize a shared human vulnerability, the ease with which conviction and coherence can be generated from within. If you recall a dream in which you were utterly convinced of something that now seems absurd, you have a faint echo of what it might be like to move through a delusional episode while awake. The key difference lies not in the bare possibility of such conviction, but in our ability to step back from it, to test it, and to be gently corrected by others when we err. Dreams, then, stand at a crossroads between ordinary consciousness and pathological states. They offer a nightly, reversible glimpse of worlds in which reality testing is relaxed and the sense of self wavers. To treat them as a model for madness is to approach mental illness with a certain humility, remembering that the distance between our most confident waking moments and our most bewildering dream states may be smaller than it feels. In the wider story of consciousness, this comparison deepens the initial doubt about whether we can be sure we are awake. It also adds a different, more compassionate layer, a sense that our hold on reality is an achievement, not a given, and that the mind's power to dream is inseparable from its power to go astray. Part 15, The Void of Dreamless Sleep. In deepest sleep, it is tempting to say that there is simply nothing. No images, no sounds, no thoughts, no dreams. The very phrase dreamless sleep seems to name an absence, a blank interval in the narrative of our lives. Philosophers and neuroscientists have often built on this intuition. Consciousness, they suggest, is what appears when we wake or when we dream, and what disappears when we sink into dreamless sleep. On this view, if you could chart the level of consciousness over a night, it would rise with waking, remain high during intense dreams, and drop to zero in the deep, silent phases in between. Yet the more closely we examine this so-called void, the less straightforward it becomes. People sometimes wake from what they insist was an experience of dreamless sleep. They report a vague but palpable sense of having been somewhere or of having been in a state, even though nothing much happened in it. There are also age-old meditative traditions that claim to cultivate a sustained awareness within sleep itself an awareness said to persist even when there are no images or stories, when the mind is as quiet as it ever becomes. Before turning to these reports, it helps to clarify our terms. When we speak of dreaming, we usually have in mind immersive scenes. We recall being in a place, facing a situation, interacting with others, or moving through events. There is a here and now structure to such dreams, a sense of presence, of being located within a world. Dreamless sleep, in ordinary speech, seems to mean simply the absence of that immersion. But what if there are forms of sleep experience that lack this immersive quality, yet are not pure nothingness? Some researchers propose a spectrum of sleep-related experiences. At one end lie full, blown dreams, rich in narrative and imagery. Closer to the middle might be isolated sensations or thoughts that never cohere into a scene, a floating phrase, a brief flash of colour, a momentary feeling of falling. At the far end, nearer the supposed void, there may be what has been called minimal phenomenal experience. Minimal phenomenal experience would be consciousness at its thinnest. No detailed content, no narrative, perhaps no clear sense of self. Yet still, in some way, an implicit sense of presence, a bare awareness that something is happening, even if that something is almost featureless. Some white dreams in which people report having experienced something during sleep but cannot say what it was may be approximations of this state. So too might certain meditative reports of witnessing deep sleep. In such practices, often grounded in Indian and Buddhist traditions, practitioners claim to observe the coming and going of dreams, and even the arrival of dreamless sleep, without losing awareness altogether. They describe a state in which ordinary objects of consciousness fall away, including thoughts and bodily sensations, yet a kind of luminous knowing remains. There is no image of a self, no narrative of events, but there is, they say, a subtle recognition of being asleep. These claims raise immediate questions. How can one know that there was experience if there is nothing concrete to remember? Could such reports instead reflect brief micro-awakenings or fleeting dreams that vanished, leaving only a trace of their occurrence? Might our language simply be straining to capture the transition between different sleep stages rather than a genuinely contentless form of awareness? Empirical work offers some clues, though not yet firm answers. Traditionally, researchers tried to map dreaming onto specific sleep stages. For a time, rapid eye movement sleep was regarded as the dreaming phase, while deeper non-REM stages were treated as dreamless. But when experimenters began waking people repeatedly from various stages and asking what they had just experienced, a more complex picture emerged. In the deepest non-REM sleep, awakenings yield a mix of responses. Some people say they were dreaming, others insist there was nothing, still others report a hazy, content-poor state that they struggle to describe. Brain imaging suggests that certain patterns of local activity, particularly in a region near the back of the brain, may correlate with the presence or absence of such reports, regardless of the global sleep stage. This has led to a shift in how sleep itself is conceived. Rather than a global condition in which the whole brain moves together from stage to stage, sleep now looks increasingly like a patchwork. Different regions can be more or less awake or asleep at different times. Local changes in activity may underlie the waxing and waning of experience even within what looks, from the outside, like a uniform state. Historically, the concept of sleep has evolved in lockstep with our understanding of dreaming. For Aristotle, sleep could be defined by the absence of perception. To be asleep was not to receive the world. Later philosophers sometimes spoke of the sleeper as dead to the world, unable even to seem to see or hear. When rapid eye movement sleep was discovered and linked to vivid dreams, this neat picture fractured. Sleep was no longer a simple negation of wakefulness, but a cycle of distinct states, one of which carried a bustling inner life almost invisible from the outside. At first, REM sleep was treated as the natural home of dreaming, with other stages relegated to the background. But as evidence accumulated that dreams and other experiences can arise in non-REM sleep as well, the association loosened. Now dreaming has been set partially adrift from the old categories of light and deep sleep. The question, when do we dream, has become more subtle, and with it the question, when, if ever, are we entirely without experience? Alongside these empirical revisions, philosophical accounts of waking have also shifted. One recent suggestion is to think of waking not simply as being conscious, but as being in a state of full capacitation. To be awake, in this sense, is to be open to the environment, poised for a wide range of actions and thoughts, able to initiate inquiry, to pursue projects, to reshape one's situation. Dreams, by contrast, are often passive. Things happen to the dream self more than they are done by it. Even when the dream self-acts, the real capacities for action in the bodily and social world lie dormant. Lucid dreams blur this distinction. In them, a dreamer may realize this is a dream and begin to exercise a more deliberate form of control, choosing to fly, to revisit a place, or to test what is possible. Here some of the epistemic and agentive capacities characteristic of waking seem to flicker into existence within sleep. If so, the border between waking and dreaming is not fixed, but porous. Dreamless sleep, on this view, marks a further step away from capacitation. Not only is there little or no engagement with an environment, there may also be little sense of self, and little capacity, even for interaction, such as deliberate thinking. Whether any residual awareness survives in such states is precisely the question at issue. This question matters not only for the philosophy of sleep, but for the broader effort to understand consciousness itself. If we define consciousness simply as what disappears in dreamless sleep and returns in waking and dreaming, we risk building a definition on empirical sand. As soon as we find credible evidence of experience in phases once thought entirely unconscious, that definition begins to crumble. Instead, some have turned the problem on its head. Rather than taking dreamless sleep as the paradigm of unconsciousness, they treat it as a clue to the minimal conditions for consciousness. What is the simplest form that experience can take? How little content can a state have while still qualifying as conscious at all? Deep content, poor sleep experiences, if they exist, might tell us something about this threshold. The image here is less of a switch, flipped from off to on, and more of a shoreline, where the waters of awareness slowly fade into the dry land of non-experience. Somewhere along that shoreline there may be states in which there is only a dim sense of being, without anything in particular that one is aware of. These states are difficult to study, easy to misdescribe, and yet potentially central to a complete theory of the mind. From the perspective of the ancient, skeptical worry about whether we are awake, the study of dreamless sleep adds a new twist. We are no longer dealing only with a contrast between clear wakefulness and deceptive dreams. We are confronting the possibility that our nights contain extended periods in which our relation to consciousness itself is ambiguous. Are we there in some delicate way when we seem to be gone, or do we disappear altogether, returning only in the sudden, unremembered moment of waking? Our ordinary introspection cannot answer this on its own. From the inside, a gap in memory feels like a gap in experience. If you cannot recall anything between lying down and hearing the alarm, there is a natural temptation to say you were not conscious at all. But memory is not a perfect record. It is selective, reconstructive, and fallible. It may fail to capture states that are, by their nature, hard to code and retain. In the end, the void of dreamless sleep may not be a simple void. It may be more like a dimly lit terrain, sparsely populated with moments of thin, fragile experience interspersed with stretches of genuine absence. We do not yet know. What is clear is that, by probing this terrain through reports, through contemplative practices, through measurements of the sleeping brain, we are forced to refine our concepts of sleep, wakefulness, and consciousness alike. To linger here at the edge of the void is to see consciousness not as an all or nothing property, but as something graded and locally instantiated. It is to recognize that the same organism, in the same bed, may pass repeatedly from rich world, simulation, to nearly contentless presence, to utter blackout, and back again. From vivid dream to psychotic episode, to the supposed emptiness of deep sleep, the mind shows us its full range. What began as a question about whether we can know we are awake thus expands into a broader inquiry into how experience waxes and wanes, thins and thickens, branches and dissolves.